Super teams have been a contentious issue for the NBA in recent years, and now the league is taking steps to address the situation head on. New super teams, star-studded squads formed by the joining of multiple superstar players, seem to be formed every offseason. Despite the excitement and high expectations that they bring with them, they also draw on criticism for potentially harming the competitive balance of the league. This year's NBA Finals actually represent a different scenario, with neither team involved being considered a super team, which is really refreshing, and it appears that the NBA prefers it that way. How do we know this? Because the league is making concrete changes to its rules to limit the effectiveness of super teams. Starting in 2024, the new NBA collective bargaining agreement will come into full effect, and teams are already bracing themselves for these seismic shifts that lie ahead. The primary objective of these rule changes is to spread out talent across the league, essentially bringing an end to the era of super teams as we know them. In an ideal world, the NBA thrives on parity, with the majority of teams pushing for playoff contention rather than just one or two dominant forces overshadowing the rest. Remember when the Warriors pre and post KD and the Cavs seemed to meet in the finals every year? While those series were really exciting at times, they were not necessarily beneficial for the league as a whole. Fans of 28 other teams spent entire regular seasons knowing that their chances of winning it all were very slim, and a disengaged fan base is the league's worst nightmare. So how do they plan to tackle the issue of super teams? It starts with money. Super teams typically have astronomical payrolls as they assemble 3 or more all-star caliber players. Without a hard salary cap in place, these teams have the ability to continue to re-sign their players and spend more and more each season to maintain their dominance. The new CBA, however, introduces a payroll line that, once exceeded, makes it significantly more challenging to field a competitive team. Once you get to that line, these rules limit the trading of first-round picks, restrict the amount of money that can be sent out in trades, and essentially force teams to sign minimum contract free agents each offseason. This so-called second apron of the luxury tax represents the closest the league has come to implementing a true hard cap on spending. And as a result, some teams are already scrambling to make significant changes in preparation for the upcoming offseason. For instance, the Golden State Warriors, one of the architects of the modern super team movement, are now going to be forced to deal with the difficult task of parting ways with at least one of their key players, Draymond Green, Klay Thompson, or Jordan Poole. Their extreme spending from the last few years will be unsustainable with these new rules, and carrying such a high payroll will severely hinder their ability to improve the roster in any meaningful way. Don't believe me? In the past, these new rules would have prevented the Warriors from bringing in Dante DiVincenzo as a free agent. The Nets' acquisition of James Harden would have been impossible, as would the midseason trade of Kevin Durant to the Suns. And this isn't the first time that the league has gone out of its way to change the rules this way. Over 2 decades ago, the NBA first introduced the luxury tax to discourage teams from exceeding the salary cap by imposing significant financial penalties. The idea was to promote parity and prevent excessive spending. Sounds familiar? By taxing teams dollar for dollar once their payroll exceeded a certain number. However, the luxury taxes had unintended consequences, actually penalizing smaller market teams rather than just curbing the spending of larger franchises. A prime example is the Oklahoma City Thunder, who drafted 3 future MVPs in consecutive drafts from 2007 to 2009. This was outstanding work by the front office and should have positioned themselves as perennial contenders. However, a few months after reaching the 2012 finals, the fear of facing a massive luxury tax bill forced the Thunder to trade away James Harden, the most egregious example of a team cutting talent to avoid the luxury tax. These smaller market teams were so afraid of a huge luxury tax bill that it essentially set a hard cap on them, while the bigger teams were still willing to spend more, giving them even more of an advantage than they had before the tax was implemented. And this new CBA in 2024 is just an extension of the already in place tax. Once you exceed that line by so much, you reach that previously mentioned second apron, and your team is basically stuck. As I mentioned earlier, player movement has gotten out of control in some people's minds. Every offseason, a new max free agent or 2 changed teams, another few grew unhappy and requested a trade. No big-time players seemed to stick around with the smaller market team that drafted them once they reached their prime, so again, the league tried to solve this. The introduction of the Supermax contract extension was intended to discourage player movement and foster team loyalty, but it really hasn't worked as intended. A Supermax contract allows players to sign larger than normal extensions with their current teams if they meet specific award criteria. The idea was to give their current team an advantage, making it financially rewarding for players to stay put. But the implementation of the Supermax has been far from flawless. The first mistake was tying Supermax to actual awards. The All-NBA voting process, which essentially determines whether a player qualifies for the Supermax, has its limitations. Inconsistencies in the voting system can now have a profound impact on the contracts players can sign and even influence free agency decisions across the league. The second mistake was that the Supermax didn't always achieve its goal of keeping players on their current teams. More often than not, teams found themselves burdened with massive contracts for players who may not have been worth that investment in the first place. Once a player becomes eligible for the Supermax, they almost always get it, regardless of whether they're actually good enough to be earning that much money. This actually made it harder for teams to build a competitive group around their now Supermax star, and sometimes players ended up requesting trades after receiving the Supermax contract anyway. And now the league is making yet another attempt to combat super teams with the introduction of this second apron. And once again, there are concerns that this latest attempt may also fall short. It could potentially hinder teams like the OKC Thunder and others, teams that have built their roster through smart moves and homegrown talent, from keeping their roster together more than a few seasons. Smart team building should be rewarded, but these new rules can actually punish it. The problem is these new rules impose salary restrictions that make it difficult for teams to retain all their key players, regardless of how they put the team together in the first place. And the consequence could actually be increased player movement, undermining the league's objective of promoting stability and parity. And that sentence right there shows you the real problem here. The league is actually attempting to fix two competing issues. They want less player movement and more player loyalty, for guys to stay put with the team that drafted them, while also wanting to spread the talent throughout the league. Reaching both of those goals at the same time is going to be impossible. Not only that, but the current approach is not even targeting the root of the issue. Super teams, at least the kind that the league is trying to eliminate, are not just about having a highly talented roster. It's about how these teams are assembled through free agency and star trades. The NBA's real objective should be addressing the construction of super teams that snatch stars away from the teams that might only have one star player and adding them to a group that already has multiple all-stars, not how much each of these teams spends to keep their group together. However, the new rules being implemented primarily focus on curbing excessive payrolls rather than specifically targeting the formation of super teams. This approach not only affects true super teams, but also teams like the Denver Nuggets, who have built their success through smart roster management rather than by stealing away stars from other teams. And this new approach by the league actually punishes the Nuggets for building their team the correct way. Their core four salaries of Jokic, Murray, MPJ, and Gordon are going to be all but impossible to keep for more than 1 or 2 more seasons. To truly address the issue, the league should consider measures to limit player movement. The constant shuffling of players signing massive contracts only to request trades shortly after, or switching teams every few seasons, is the real concern, not high payrolls. However, regulating player movement is much easier said than done. Implementing rules that restrict the frequency of trades or limit free agency could prove impractical and potentially detrimental to the league. The NBA's popularity has surged in recent years, partially due to the excitement generated by player movement itself. Fans have become captivated by the drama of a league where truly anything can happen at any moment, completely changing the landscape of the league, elevating the engagement of NBA fans all year round. Restricting player movement may appease some fan bases and create more parity, but it might not actually be beneficial for the league as a whole. So where does all of this lead us? Well, teams are basically going to be forced to pick 2 franchise players and build their roster around them with supporting role players. Regardless of draft steals or player development success, teams will no longer be allowed to build an overly competitive team, regardless of how they are constructed. The new reality of the NBA will be spreading out talent to provide opportunities for all, potentially solving the super team issue, but likely introducing new challenges for the league. And that creates a really uncertain future for the NBA.